it perfectly. So, alrighty, we are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the WPAMA. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are a brand new watcher with us. This is a weekly WordPress content series hosted by WP Buffs and me, Allie Nimmons. In case you don't know, every week we round up your questions on a specific topic and then sit down with a really cool person to answer them live on YouTube. So if you're just tuning in and you have any questions about this topic, please leave them in the YouTube chat here below. I'll be monitoring those and I'll grab those questions out from the chat as we get them. This episode will be available to watch here on YouTube. If you need to step away and come back later, you'll be able to watch it here forever. And we'll be adding custom people written captions to this video within the next 24 to 48 hours or so. So this week, I'm super excited to be talking about content creation with Maddy Osman. Hi, Maddy.
Hi, Allie. Thanks for having me.
Yay, thank you for being here. I love your background, by the way. I've always meant to tell you that. It's so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes these Zoom calls a little less, blah, I guess.
Yeah, a little more fun. So we have a good amount of questions here, but before we dive into those questions, just take a minute to tell all of us, I know who you are and I know what you do, but there might be people watching who are not familiar with your amazing work and amazing story. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Maddy Osman and I run an SEO content agency called the BlogSmith. We work with, I would say, primarily B2B tech brands, a lot of them in the WordPress space. So a lot of them that if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with them. WP Buffs being a previous client of mine, and also things like web hosts, brands that make plugins, or, different brands that provide any sort of connector to WordPress. What else was I going to say? In the WordPress community, I'm pretty active as a WordCamp co-organizer. So WordCamp Denver, I have helped with the past, I want to say 3 or 4 years. Currently deciding what to do about that this year. And, but hopefully we could have it back in person next year for sure. I am definitely crossing my fingers on that one. But besides that, I also help with the WordPress Denver Meetup group, which, we've kind of been trying to also figure out this virtual, not in person thing. And so, more to come on that as we figure it out. But yeah, I love this community. That's why, most of my clients are in this space, and hoping to drop some knowledge bombs today. We'll see.
Wonderful. Yeah, all that is awesome. We met for the first time at a WordCamp. First and only time I think we met at a WordCamp, which is how I meet most people in this space. So I definitely miss having those experiences and seeing people like you in person. But I'm really happy that you're here on the show now. We get to connect here. I apologize in advance. I have a very clingy cat who's making a lot of noise. So I might probably mute myself as you answer questions just to make sure that you are not being disruptive.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
Exactly. Okay, so cool. Let's go ahead and dive in with the first question here on my list, which we're diving right into the deep end. This question is, are you worried about the impact of GPT-3 and AI content generation? Why or why not? So maybe before we go into the answer, can you explain, I know what AI is, artificial intelligence. Can you explain what GPT-3 is for those of us who don't know?
Totally. So, and I'm not super familiar with the technicalities behind it, but essentially it's a tool, an API or an interface or something that you can use to generate content automatically. So it's an AI, I guess you could say, or a machine learning functionality. But basically a lot of tools have taken this framework, API, whatever you want to call it, and then built tools around it. So just to name a couple, Write Sonic is one, Headlime is another, and then Nicheness is a third. These are tools that you would probably come across if you're familiar with Product Hunt, and if you're, looking at their emails and new things that are popping up that, people put out there. They're kind of untested. They're kind of in beta mode, but are starting to gain popularity. And I guess with GPT-3, it's not just about being able to auto generate copy. I've seen applications of it where people are basically like typing in, for example, creating like a website where they say like, I want something that's like Spotify, but it does this, and they'll describe it with text. So I guess what it is it's kind of like a text to something else generator, or like a text to something else expander, you could say. And so it goes beyond copy, but the worry for people like myself who do copywriting, content creation, is that like, what if these tools get so advanced that they take over our jobs? And we're already seeing things where you could use these tools to do things like generating summaries. So like, I think one cool application of it, before I get into the answer to the question, are things like if you take a blog post that you've created and then run it through one of these tools, like summary functionalities, that could be a great application for sharing it on social, because obviously you're not going to copy paste all your blog text and use that on Twitter or something. But sometimes when you're done writing a blog topic, the last thing you want to do is have to go in and write that social copy. And so what's actually really cool about these tools is it might be able, or might be able to make your job a little bit easier when it comes to promoting the content that you're creating. And again, before answering the question fully, I think another cool use case of these tools are things like, maybe you're stuck on like a certain way of saying things, you can't figure out the right word, or, there's just like one part of it that you're just not able to get. And so I think that another really cool use of these tools is to take that sort of first stab at a topic, but then the important thing is to go in and like make it your own instead of just leaving it as is. And so to answer the question and kind of pull it all together, the reason why I'm not afraid of these tools taking my job is because essentially, if it's generated by an algorithm, it seems fair to assume that Google's going to be able to take those same inputs, those same whatever it makes up the algorithm that these tools are using, which many of them are using variations on a theme that connects back to this GPT-3 tool, to figure out what's happening and to sort of like invalidate that content, or like just make it so that it doesn't show up as high in relevant search, because it isn't written by a human. And by Google's like own terminology, they actually say in the Google search quality rater guidelines that, anything that's like auto-generated text, they call it low quality content. So we know that's how they think. We know that at the end of the day, the most important thing for them is the user and serving the user. And it's ultimately for that purpose that I'm not worried about it. But I think instead of having like an antagonistic view of these tools, like what I'm doing is I'm scooping them all up and I'm playing with them, because there are applications for them in my business to make my life easier, or again, to sort of like take that first stab at something. I'm trying to think, there's this other tool I've been using recently. Let me see if I could find it really quick. But it's essentially like a Google Chrome extension that works not only in Google Docs, but Google Docs is where I use it. And you can basically take a sentence and like rewrite it. And so again, it's like if you're having that, whatever it is, where you just like can't come up with the wording that you're looking for, I think it's called WordTune. But anyway, so that's another like similar idea type of tool. But yeah, I think that Google is smart enough, or they will become smart enough to find this AI generated copy, and they're still going to reward the people that, are writing themselves. And I think the other like last piece on that is, it can generate copy, but it doesn't necessarily understand style or formatting. It doesn't necessarily generate visuals, although there are tools that exist now based on AI where you can like create images, you can create whole new faces of people that don't exist. And so again, like these tools will continue to become more complicated. That's not exactly the right word, but they'll get better and better at solving the issues that we have. But I think we're like far off from worrying about it taking our jobs.
That makes a lot of sense. Like the first thing that I was thinking of is brand and tone and voice. Like, so many of the brands that we love and the content that we love is because we feel that humanness in it, and that sort of almost
Right.
imperfection to the way that it's written. It's like, yeah, there's a real person that wrote this. I can sit
Totally.
and read something you wrote and hear your voice in my head reading it. And if it's completely just popped out by an AI, you completely lose that bit to it. And that's always where my mind goes to when I hear about people talking about, AI and robots taking jobs and things. It's They're not going to be able to create that creativity and that feeling. And so, yeah, I totally hear where you're coming from. And I didn't even know that was a thing of like AI generated content as far as what we're talking about here. And that's pretty wild. But yeah, you answered that really, really thoroughly.
I've been
Yeah,
thinking about
maybe.
it a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's an important thing to think about. I mean, I like that you kind of turned it into like, well, there are benefits to it. Like it can help you be a better writer.
Totally.
Get out of here.
Okay.
Like, one of the things I was thinking of is like, maybe if you need to write content in English and English is not your first language, maybe this is something that can kind of help you to get those ideas out a little bit better. No,
Sure.
you cannot be on the video. So yeah, this is super cool. Like, I'm definitely going to kind of keep my eye out for more information about this moving forward. Oh, we have Joe Casabona. He's here. He sent a little wave
Hi,
emoji.
Joe.
Hi, Joe. Joe's the best. He was on a couple weeks ago. Can you
I was
say?
going to say, I remember seeing that he did one of these recently.
Yeah, we had a great time. Awesome. So let's move on to question number 2. What is changing with SEO and content creation? What's staying the same regardless of recent changes?
Sure. So, in the idea of natural language processing, which kind of relates back to AI because Google uses like AI and machine learning to make sense of language when we're typing things into search. So Google had a huge algorithm update. I want to say it was like, it might have been late 2019, but anyway, it was the Bert update. And so Bert is basically a tool that, or an algorithm or a machine learning thing, something like that, that allows Google to make sense of words, both, the way that you read it, how to, whatever, but also backwards. And this was a huge thing within Google and what has been considered like the biggest algorithm update in years because it added subtlety, it added context to search where Google, they give an example on the blog post that they used to like announce this change. And it was something about like traveling to Brazil, but from the perspective of someone like going there on vacation versus somebody like moving there or something like that. And the context was lost in the original search because it didn't have Bert at that time. But once the Bert change was applied, Google showed basically how things changed and how they were able to serve a much more relevant search result. And so I guess the main thing that's changing is the fact that Google doesn't need you to be as like blatant with keyword use. You don't have to use that like exact match keyword 50 times in your content and in all these other key signal areas. You should still follow best practices for on-page SEO, which state that you should use a primary keyword in your title and your meta description and so on. At the same time, it's kind of giving us this hint that as we move towards the future, being so blatant isn't going to be as necessary to be able to show up in that relevant search. So I'm kind of like in my agency, sort of in between that, like how blatant do we be because we know what's coming, but we're also like optimizing for what it is right now. But I think the takeaway is that you don't have to stuff keywords. You don't have to use exact match keywords. You can kind of, like add the or a, or you can make them less awkward. So it's stuff like that. It's thinking towards the future. It's going to be a lot more about like just speak directly to the human, right? Versus like using the search engine as the intermediary and sort of sacrificing language so that you show up. So that's really good news. I think in terms of like what's staying the same is the fact that like great content that answers users questions is always going to be the top ranking thing. And potentially even years later. One of my first blogs was a lifestyle blog, and it was like when I lived in Chicago, just like the stuff that I did, like how you could live in a big city on a budget was kind of the theme of it. And I wrote this post about going to Lollapalooza, and I used to volunteer, and that was the way that I got in for free, essentially. And so I created a blog topic that was something like free Lollapalooza tickets, and I searched it a couple weeks ago just for like another SEO example, and it's still like ranking like number 3 or number 4, and I haven't updated that blog since like, I don't know, 2015 or 2016. And so it goes to show the title was like totally a little bit clickbaity, because it's like, I'm not just like giving you free Lollapalooza tickets, but I am giving you a way to get them. And it's just like, I wrote that post like with love. I wasn't trying to like do some like weird SEO stuff. It was like, this is my experience, and I just want to kind of like answer any questions that people have, because there really aren't that many resources, even on like Lollapalooza's website, that really get into like what it's actually like to be a Lollapalooza volunteer. And it kind of relates back to the Google Search Quality Rater Guidelines, which is a document that I would recommend anyone who does SEO should read it. If you don't, it's a little bit dense at like 175 pages. But if this is your, if this is your job, you should read it. But in the guidelines, they talk about EAT, which is just like different things that help Google understand if you're like qualified to talk about a certain thing. And they talk about lifestyle topics and like stuff like medical. It's like, obviously most of us aren't qualified to give medical advice, but what most of us are qualified to give is this like everyday expertise, is what they call it. And so it's like, I wouldn't, be able to get away with talking about something like how to cure, I don't know, lung cancer or whatever. But I could say like, I could write a topic that said, this was my experience, like having, if I had it, lung cancer, and like going through treatment, and like, here's what happened to me, or here's what, like I can share from that experience. And so, that's kind of like a line to keep in mind, like something that you're expert on in your own life because you have this experience, versus like trying to appear like a doctor expert based on that experience that you have. If it's relevant to you and you present it that way, instead of trying to be like the be all and end all of all medical advice about lung cancer or whatever, that there's value to that. And so I guess just to kind of wrap this topic up, there are a lot of changes that happen within the SERPs, which is the search engine results pages. So that's just what you see after you hit enter when you type in a query. And one that I've noticed recently is at the very bottom of search, there's this section called searches related to. And just the other day I was looking at it, and now it's just called related searches. And, a lot of it is like the same level of detail that you would expect to see there. But it's just like a reminder, like Google's always changing stuff. And the interface in which you're trying to rank so that people find your content is always changing. And so you have to be cognizant of that. You have to be aware of those changes and how they impact you, so that if necessary, you can go back in and re-optimize your content to show up there.
Yeah, absolutely. That was such a thorough response. That was awesome. And you actually kind of answered, Joe Casabona put a couple questions in the chat for us.
Sure.
And you kind of answered the first one that he asked, which was, what's the benefit of hiring a content creator versus trying to do it yourself? Mm-hmm. So it sounds like doing it yourself is like you were saying, that content comes directly from you, from your experience. You could speak to it the best. So on the flip side of that, I mean, when you go ahead and hire somebody else, if I'm hiring a Maddy to write, content for me, where do I then benefit from letting go of that voice and perspective and allowing you to go ahead and do that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's a very hard thing, right? Like so many people want to do their own content creation. And then of course, it inevitably falls to the wayside as real life kicks in and emergencies, and you just have a limited amount of energy. And I think that a lot of us have a writer in us, right? But most of us don't nurture it. And so it just becomes like this cumbersome task. And what I hear a lot from the people that I work with who are, willing to give up that control is just the fact that it's nice to have it done. Done is better than perfect. But if you want to get closer to perfect, I think the secret is like have a style guide, because you can create consistency and you can get what you want, but not unless you give direction for it. It's hard to just like go to a writer and say like, here's a keyword, like run with, good luck, because they can create something. And sometimes it is a good idea to trust the writer, especially if that's their niche, to come up with something that'll be good, that, makes sense for the topic. And that's going to be a unique perspective if you're letting them run with it. But at the same time, it's better to take a little bit of time to put together a brief that just says like, here are some things I would like to see in this. Here are some things I definitely don't want you to talk about. Maybe here's an example of an article that does a great job that you could either use for research or as sort of like inspiration for what we want to like be better than, and different things like that. So, one of the most effective ways for a writer to take like what's in your head and translate that into an article is to have like a content interview as part of the process. And that's something that we do at the BlogSmith for clients that want to do that. A lot of our more technical topics are straightforward in that there's a lot of information out there that we can use. But if it's something more like from a thought leadership angle, or, more like in the niches of a topic, or especially if it's like a tool where, they have like a new feature update, it's like, I would like to talk to the people who put that together and sort of get their take on it before I try to interpret it. So I think that's honestly the secret, is to use your resources and be available to the writer. And it doesn't have to take, a whole lot of time out of your day, but just to have 20 to 30 minutes to be able to dig in and ask any questions that you have, I think would result in a much better piece of content that's representative of you versus, taking one of these like more, for example, thought leader concepts, and trying to just like, giving them the keyword and telling them to run with it. It's going to create two very different pieces of content.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. And I just latched onto one thing you said, which I think is so important, which is like done a lot of times is better than perfect. Especially I think if you're trying to build a body of content, like even I can say with this series that we're doing now, like the initial episodes, where I think this is episode 22 or 23, the first couple were kind of rough and we had lots of technical difficulties, but I'm glad that I just did it and published them and pushed through and everyone got a little bit smoother. And it can be intimidating, I think, to put out content regularly if you don't feel like it's perfect, especially if you're kind of a perfectionist type of person. But yeah, if that content is there and if the intention is there, it ends up being like your Lollapalooza blog post where, it just came from this good place. You wanted to share this knowledge and it ended up being successful. I mean, before I really became more active in the WordPress community, I started a channel similar to this one. And I was putting out like simple little WordPress tutorial videos. And I really tried to have that mindset of like, just do it, just release it and then move on to the next one. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I mean, one of them, I just went and found it because your blog post reminded me of it. I posted it in 2017. It's about how to create a opt-in freebie form in MailChimp, and it has 20,000 views on it from 2017. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I know, I check on it every once in a while. I'm like, man, you're doing really well. And I have a comment from 6 days ago saying that somebody, it helped them to do what they had to do. And like, if you look at the rest of the content on that channel, most of it is not super duper successful, but it's like, I really tapped into one thing that people were looking for and it like totally took off. And like, that's a really fun thing for me about putting content out into the world is, you can optimize up and down and sideways. And sometimes it just doesn't grab people. And sometimes you put something out there and it's exactly what people needed. And so why not do that gamble? Like, why not try and potentially be that thing that somebody was looking for, all day long. So yeah, that's my main takeaway so far is better done than perfect.
And I think like a point that you're getting at here is sometimes the topics that are the most successful kind of surprise us.
Yeah.
Like you might not have expected that would be the one with 20,000 views, right?
Not at
But
all.
if you didn't put it out there, you would never know. And so
Exactly.
that's what content marketing is. It's just like, let's keep trying stuff and see what sticks.
Absolutely. So that kind of leads us, still kind of talking about that Lollapalooza blog post. I think it's going to follow us through their conversation. Joe actually had another question. Do clickbait headlines really work that well versus a straight informative headline? So it sounds like from that one example, yeah, that clickbait title really seems to work. But do you think that was kind of an outlier, or do you find that is really a pattern that when you kind of jazz up those titles and put those kind of buzzwords in there, that they do actually get more traction?
Sure. Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer for sure, because I think, you could say that the Lollapalooza one is a little bit misleading, but at the same time, it does answer the expectation of like, this is how you would get into Lollapalooza for free, right? But there are more extremes and more like things that are at odds rather with these like clickbait headings. And I think like BuzzFeed is a good example. I think most of the time they strike a pretty good balance, but there are things where it's like, really, like, why did I click this? And you're like, where's the answer, Or like, what even article am I reading? Because this is not the one I expected. And so that's the problem, is when your clickbait heading leads to content that was not expected. And so it's a delicate balance for sure. And I think the way that we handle it on my team is we want to satisfy expectations. And so like what we do is before writers submit new content, they go through and use some sort of like headline analysis tool. So like CoSchedule has a really good one. There's also this like emotional headline analyzer tool. I'm trying to remember who made it. It was like a marketing association, but if you look up like emotional headline analyzer, you'll find it. And it's just a matter of like trying to find balance between the different elements, trying to put your best foot forward with how you're explaining your content. Because I mean, realistically, if your title is not good, people are just not going to read it. And it's so sad that you could create this like really awesome content, but like that's the thing that's holding you back from, getting those views and maybe conversions down the line. So I think at the end of the day, if it feels like there's a mismatch between the content and the heading, that's what you want to look out for. It's okay to be a little bit sensational as long as you fulfill the promise that you're making.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. I mean, my favorite kind of content is like when there's something super clickbaity and I click on it and it actually does deliver. Like the content is as like ridiculous or whatever as I thought it was going to be, or even more so. But I think like really pointing that out, that the disparity is what's important, right? If you're looking for something and you open up an article and it's not at all what you were looking for, like, yeah, that's really frustrating. That makes me not want to ever click on anything that person posts again, because I'm like, well, I don't trust you,
And it can hurt your website's bounce rate too. So just going back to like stats and like things that we don't want to see, a high bounce rate, generally a bad thing to see on your website that needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. Awesome. So we have a couple more questions in the chat, which I love. Nice. This next question comes from Patrick Rowland. And Patrick says, I found that a lot of WordPress articles sound similar. Sometimes the top 10 results on the SERP are almost identical. So my question is, how do you not sound like every other blog out there? Which I think I've definitely asked myself that before, where it's like, okay, I'm competing for a question or, a query that I know a lot of other people are answering. How do I differentiate myself from all of the other answers? So how do you approach that typically?
Totally. I think that's something that like any content creator struggles with nowadays, especially as content is becoming this like search currency. Like that's the main way that you're going to get traffic from search, is an investment in content. And so we're all kind of on the same page with that. And unfortunately, that also means that we're all competing with each other for it.
Yeah.
So it is hard. I think that the way to stand out is one of the things we already talked about, which is offering your unique experience, right? So let's just like take the example of a top 10 list of, like maybe image optimization plugins or something like that. So some ways that you could make it unique would be share like, what did you do with your website? How did you test out these different options? And how did they result in different page load or even like image quality? So like creating a matrix of things that you could compare them to each other and how that worked on your website. I think Code in WP does a really good job of doing stuff like this. Like when they're comparing web hosts or plugins, they usually have like one of those matrices where it's like, okay, here's how this one, on speed, on image quality, on whatever, and then here's how this one compares. And you can kind of see at a glance, and I think there's a lot of value in that. Besides that, again, going back to like the idea of interviewing, like maybe you could try to seek out some quotes from the creators of these different plugins that haven't already been published. So, just going on Twitter or using their contact form on their website and just saying, hey, I'm writing this article about the top 10 image optimization plugins. And I just want to know, like, how you would compare yourself to like these other plugins that I'm considering adding to this list. What can you say about that? What can you say about maybe the reasons why you even created the solution in the first place? Did it come from a personal need? Like, did you have image optimization problems on your website? And that's what, prompted you to do this. So whenever you're reaching out, you definitely want to have a prompt for them so they don't have to like create the content out of nowhere. And you also want to give them time to answer too. So, like, don't just send it out and you're going to publish the next day, right? Like maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. You don't want to do too long of a time frame because then people just won't do anything because you're giving them too much time. But be reasonable and respect people's time. And I think that you'll get some good, unique insights. And then the last thing kind of along the same lines is a similar idea, which is to maybe do like an expert roundup. And so if you're looking for examples of how this is done really well, DataBox, they do these all the time. It's like pretty much the totality, I think, of their blogging and content creation efforts. But what they're essentially doing is asking those questions, coming up with a curated list of questions and sending them out to like marketers and people in the tech space, essentially their target audience, people that represent that and people who represent experts in that area. And using their responses to flesh out their content. So I think the secret to being successful with that specific tactic is you don't just want to have like a list of everybody's responses. You want to format it nicely. You want to like, think of like different headings and like how you would structure it and then like place those expert insights within. But the benefit of having, these other people involved, whether it's through that way or like the other interview suggestion I just gave is it gives some credence to your article. It adds, maybe you don't have everyday expertise for that topic, but these people do. And so that's just another way to show Google, like, we have authority on this, you can trust this content because we're literally talking to people who use these plugins and have, things to say about them. So I think that's what it is. It's like, put a little bit of extra effort into not just looking at what's already out there, but like create new content by talking to people who know what they're talking about.
Absolutely. I love all of that. I mean, those are things that I tend to do in my own content on this channel. Even the tutorial videos that I make, usually I'll go look at maybe the 5 ones that are ranking highest for whatever keyword I'm going after. I'll watch those videos and I will try to identify like, what does this video not do very well? What is maybe this one mention that this one doesn't mention, and how can I mention as, touch on as many things as possible so that when somebody is going through and they're like, well, this one's helped me over here, but not over here. Like, how can my video be a complete picture and be that one solution that that person will be like, oh, finally, like, this is what I was looking for. So a lot of it is kind of like going back to the example of, the top 10 results for a WordPress article. I would personally just say, yeah, looking at those articles and trying to figure out what they lack and how you can serve that. I love what you said about the matrices. Like, I love content that I can skim, I can find what I need quickly, especially when you're dealing with something like WordPress or something technical. Most times I feel like, and this is purely anecdotal, but I feel like people are looking for like, I have a problem right now that I'm trying to solve. It's not like, oh, I'm going to take the afternoon and learn about WordPress. It's like, no, like something is wrong and I need a solution for it. Or, my images are super slow. I need to find the plugin to optimize them right now. And so giving that information in a super concise way, like I hate videos where the first 60 seconds is saying the keywords over and over and asking the person to subscribe to the channel. It's like, no, just tell me. No,
that later.
Exactly. So that's my personal recommendation, is like just trying to find ways to improve upon what those people have done, that is, whatever they've done that's successful, how can I make it even better? So yeah.
I think you've hit a lot of nails on the head in terms of like readability, skimming, like formatting is so important. And then in terms of like, you really should keep the competition in mind, even though you're not trying to recreate those articles, you still need to know what you're up against.
Yeah.
And I mean, there lots of good knowledge bombs there.
Nice. Alrighty. Question number 6. This one also comes from the chat. It comes from Sam Mamoser. And Sam asks, what tools do you use when you're trying to develop better content?
She's going to be so happy you got her name right. Everybody always butchers it. Okay, wait, repeat the question. Sorry.
What tools do you use when you're trying to develop better content?
Okay, yeah. So I've been playing around with a lot of tools lately, and we've talked a little bit about like some of those AI interesting tools that are worth looking into. I'm going to share another Google Doc add-on. It's called G Suites, just like lowercase g and then the word suites. And it's kind of cool because it basically makes it easier to add like inline elements without having to like hit, the formatting bars and stuff. So it adds things like headings really easily without having to like go and like drag it down and find your heading 3 tag or whatever. And you can also add GIFs really easily. So it's just like one of those things where it's like, for anybody who's not doing content every day, they'd be like, what's the point of this? How does this help? But for like me and you, Allie, like it makes a huge difference to just have that stuff like easy. And I'm like bad at keyword shortcuts and memorizing them because it's like I have all these different tools and they all have different ones. And so stuff like that doesn't really work well for me personally, but stuff like this where it's like you basically do like a slash command and then it's like heading or whatever and it shows up. So maybe not useful for everyone, but for those who are creating a lot of content, it's just a little bit of a productivity boost. From like an optimization standpoint, I've been really digging ClearScope and Phrase for Phrase more specifically for like the briefing process of creating content. But the way that they both work is going in, taking those like top 10 to like 30 search results and then sort of reverse engineering them and giving you ideas like what are some like headings we should include. So starting to get to what the structure should look like. What are questions that people would want answered? What are some like statistics or external sources that a lot of these different content pieces are using that people might want to know about? So it a little bit, gets into that like worrisome space of I don't want to create the content that everybody else is creating, right? At the same time, I want to be aware of what my competition is doing. And I also want to be aware of what Google holds as like, what are the different like terms and phrases I should be including and thus how that influences structure. So it's both of these tools essentially help to create that good foundation from which you should then expand upon with, your own experience or expert testimonial and stuff like that. Market Muse is another one I've been playing with for very similar reasons. And so there's a lot of different variations on the same sorts of ideas. If I had to pick one of the three, I would say ClearScope, because ClearScope also does this really cool like outline generation functionality that is kind of in beta right now, but is getting better and better by the day. And ClearScope, just to kind of close the loop on that, is like a content optimization tool. I would say more so than a briefing tool in that it checks, it basically suggests different entities or like nouns, people, places, things that should be present in your article. And then it says like if you're doing that optimally, basically. And it also gives you ideas about like how long the content should be according to what's currently ranking and different things like that. So those are some of like the biggest ones I use. You certainly want to have, if you're working with other people, even just with yourself, you want to have some sort of like project management tool so you can keep track of content in progress, and more specifically like an editorial calendar, just to organize your ideas and make sure that you're not doing like too much of the same thing in a row, because you want to mix it up. Like a good example is like on my website, I'll do tool reviews, but I wouldn't want to do like 4 tool reviews in a row. I want to kind of break that up with like content that's more like how to in general, or digging into like a specific strategy or something like that. I'm trying to think if there's any other like major tools that I would recommend right now. Grammarly, always pro tool. And one reason why, besides what you would think, is it helps you check for any sort of like unintentional plagiarism. Sometimes we're like taking examples from other websites and we want to make sure, and like, I think especially with WordPress and like code snippets and stuff like that, like it's hard to, like, if it's such like a basic thing, like how do you create divs or tables or whatever? It's like, how would I make this text unique, right? But Grammarly is a really good way to sort of check and make sure that you're not intentionally, like copying another website, because duplicate content is a real issue. And in most cases, like Google has come out and said like duplicate content won't result in a penalty per se, but that doesn't mean that there are no consequences to having duplicate content. And the main one being that whatever website you would be taking that content from is probably going to rank higher than you because they already had it originally, right? Just for that simple reason. Even like all else equal, if you have a better, domain authority and ability to rank in relevant search, Google's probably still going to go with the original source in most cases. So, yeah, man, I mean, I have so many tools, but those are kind of like the top ones that I'm thinking about right now. It's like, how do I optimize this content? How do I make sure that I'm free of like spelling errors? And then how can I make things easier, like in terms of like that G Suites thing? How can I improve on sort of like my daily, content creation efforts to create productivity improvements?
Nice. Those are all super helpful. I definitely want to check out the G Suites thing. One of the programs that I really love, which kind of reminds me of it a little bit, is called, have you ever used the Hemingway app editor?
Yeah.
I love that thing. It's incredibly useful for those listening. It picks out things like if you're using too many adverbs, if you're like, I have it pulled up right here. If you're using passive voice, which for instructional materials, active voice is usually better. If there are phrases that you're overcomplicating, if you're making your sentences too long or your sentences are too hard to read, and it gives your work a readability like grade by like grades. Like I think the goal a lot of times is around like 5, 6, or 7 is pretty good, because that's sort of, it seemed counterintuitive when I first started using it. I was like, well, I want my writing to be, when you're in school, it's always like, oh, you want your writing to be very advanced and very, whatever. And Taylor Walden from Give WP actually introduced me to this tool, and she was like, no, like the writing has to be as simple as possible so that people can understand it, no matter what their first language is, no matter if they're just skimming it, like it has to be super readable. And so I always run everything I write through Hemingway and just kind of get rid of my tendency for run-on sentences and tons of commas and, break things up. So yeah, we just gave out a lot of resources and tools. So I will make sure to go back and add some of those to the description so that people can go and grab those a little bit more easily.
Yeah, I want to riff on that for just a second.
Yeah.
So I think like one of my favorite things to do is just like read. Like ever since I was a kid, like I've always enjoyed just getting lost in a good story and coming to terms with the fact that have to kind of like kill your darlings in your writing for the web.
Yeah.
It was really hard for me to do. And I think I was in denial, like at the beginning, like, no, I'm just going to write it the way I want to, you know,
Yeah,
I'm going
me
to
too.
include those good words. But you have to kind of consider again that like readability, skimmability, and the impacts those things and the reading level that had the impact that has on ranking and relevant search. And ClearScope also, you know, tells you what your reading level is, because to them, you know, to their software, like they're considering that an important ranking signal to some extent. I think, you know, like a good example of someone to learn from to some extent is Stephen King. Like he actually does get pretty verbose in his books, but then he talks about in his memoir on writing, which is also just about like writing in general and his tips. He also talks about like saying what you mean as concisely as possible. So like obviously he doesn't always like follow his own advice on that, but it's a good reminder that like that's the ideal he holds dear in his head, even though he sometimes goes against that. It's worth keeping in mind. Conciseness, like ultimately is the goal with online writing, despite how you may want to, you know, use more flowery language. You might want to save that for not SEO writing, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're writing instructional material, you want someone to be able to follow along with it as easily as possible. And yeah, sometimes I've been in that boat where you are, where like I want to write this, like I wrote, you know, my 12th grade English papers where I was writing about poetic literature, and it's like, no, you're basically writing an instruction manual, and so it has to be a little bit more dry. But I think there's ways around that too, right? Like using that piece of content and saying, okay, well, there's maybe an introduction that I'm going to be writing and a conclusion to the piece that I'm going to be writing, and maybe that's where I can be a little bit more, add a little bit more of my personality and my flair. And then when I actually get into, you know, the tutorial or the list or whatever, that's where I, you know, like you said, kill your darlings and make sure that that language is super duper concise. A good friend of mine, David Yard, he's a branding specialist, and he talks a lot about lovability. He always uses that term, like making your brand lovable. And it's so difficult to like write technical things and be lovable at the same time. So it's definitely like a balance that you have to kind of find when I think when you're creating that kind of content.
Yeah, no, for sure. That I like putting it in that frame. It's a good way to think about it.
Absolutely. All right. It looks like we have time for probably about one more question. But if you have a question for Maddy and you're watching, throw it in the chat and I'll make sure that we get to it, even if we do a super lightning round. But I definitely wanted to touch on this last question, which is what does content creation look like as a team process? And I think you are the perfect person to speak to this, because fairly recently you pivoted from freelancing to operating as a team with the BlogSmith. And so I'd love for you to speak to like how that process took place and the things that you've kind of learned in coming to terms with spreading the workload between multiple people, that intercommunication, the processes for that, and so on.
Totally. Yeah. So it definitely takes your writing or your content creation efforts to a new level when you are then like including other people in it. And I'm talking specifically about like writers and editors. So that's kind of like how my team is set up. And there's some other people who do other pieces of that. Like I have somebody who helps me with keyword research stuff. So that's like the first step. And then I guess we'll just start with kind of like what the process looks like. So it's keyword research and then outlining we do on a different day than drafting, because I want the editor who's working with my writers to go through that, make sure that, you know, we're kind of on the right track with what we're presenting in the outline versus like whatever was kind of asked for in the brief. Making sure it's, you know, relevant to this client versus like, you know, just talking about the topic in general. So the outline gets written by the writer, the editor approves it, and then the writer goes in and takes any comments, extra, you know, things that the editor brought up, and then they go into the draft mode. And then from there, it's kind of just a back and forth if there are any edits, whether that's from the editor, whether that's from the client, until we're finally done with the content. And for many clients, not necessarily all of them, we're then taking that piece and uploading it to WordPress for them. So that's kind of what the flow looks like. But in terms of how to make it work, it definitely starts with a style guide. And so that's like when I decided that this was the way I wanted to go, that was really the first thing that I put effort into creating of like any of our processes. Because when I started working with writers and editors, and I didn't hire any editors until I really felt strongly about my style guide and where it was at, because it would just honestly be worthless to bring somebody in who, I would just have to edit their work after, essentially. And not because they wouldn't have the skill to do it, because our style guide is based on AP style, which is just like news journalism writing and presenting facts, as like straightforward as possible. But it's more than that, because news writing is different than SEO content writing, and it's those like subtleties that are important. So anyway, the style guide is where it really all started, and it was just a matter of going through when I was doing edits with my writers to figure out like what are the things that like I'm consistently editing. And I think in doing edits and working with writers, you can't blame the writer or the editor if something goes wrong if you never took the time to articulate like your stance on the topic, or even like an explanation for why we're doing it this way. So like a lot of what I've been doing is just learning like, how am I coming across in my direction, and how can I make it more clear what it is exactly that I want. So it really starts with that. But I think the other thing is like, you definitely need to have a great project management system. And I actually decided that it wasn't a project management tool that I wanted to use, but a process management tool, which essentially for us just means that you're creating like a task template, and it has like all these supportive details like videos or like extra explanation, but then it's also like smaller tasks within that you check off. And then when your stuff is done, it just goes to the next person, basically. So that's how we're handling like all those back and forth things, especially the edits. That's when like, that was one of the harder things I think to figure out in the process, because it's like there are so many points at which edits might come in, and they might come about multiple different times because of just like, different stages that the content is in. So you need to have a style guide if you're working with writers. You need to have a project management tool to keep everything straight. And you also need to have like an intranet, because besides like the specific details of how to do that task, you might have some like client specific information you want to refer to, like an intake form, or, like their customers that they might want featured in their content, and just like things like that. And it's also like a repository for just how to use the different tools we use, besides the stuff we use every day, the stuff that we don't use every day, and giving access to like different accounts that we use. So like stock photos, or like I have like some test WordPress sites that people can use to get screenshots and things like that. So to me, like that's the trifecta of the things that you need to be successful.
Awesome. That was super thorough. I love it. Awesome. Well, we are pretty much at the end of our time, so we'll go ahead and wrap things up there. Thank you so much, Maddy. Seriously, I know that these days adding yet another Zoom call to your schedule can be kind of exhausting, so I really appreciate you spending part of your day with us. Where can people find you or get in touch with you if they want to learn more about what you do?
Sure. So you could check out the BlogSmith at theblogsmith.com, or say hi to me on Twitter. I'm always happy to answer any questions about content. It's just at Maddy Osman, the way my name is spelled. And that's pretty much where I'm most active.
Awesome. Also, I will say Maddy is no stranger to the WP Buffs multiverse. One of our most recent podcast episodes is featuring Maddy. So if you head over to WPMR.com/podcast, you can find a full Joe titled it something like the Content Creation and SEO Masterclass with Maddy Osman. So yeah, if you have enjoyed anything that we've talked about today, that podcast episode is definitely going to really feed into that kind of content if this is stuff that you like. So all right, everybody, we will see you next week. Thank you so much to everyone who watched and submitted questions. We really appreciate it. We do this every single Wednesday, so we will definitely see you again next week. Make sure you go to go to wpbuffs.com/WP-AMA-series. You can sign up there to get early access to the next speaker, submit your questions first, make sure they get answered first. And if you want to find out more about us, just go to wpbuffs.com. We're always there, happy to answer questions. So have a good one, folks. We'll see you next time.